Hi, today I'd like to talk to you about Wei tea. So traditionally, Wei tea has two historic origins. One is a city called Fuding, and another is a city called Zhenghe. They're both in eastern Fujian province of China. Most of the Wei teas nowadays come from within the jurisdiction of Fuding. There's a township in Fuding called Diantou, and that's where the Wei tea are particularly known for. So the Wei tea that we're going to be having today is a Wei tea that comes from Diantou of Fuding. So Wei teas are actually named after picking grade. So out of all the Wei teas, if it's a traditional Wei tea, there are really just four names for it. Based on the picking grade, if it's a single bud, it's called silver needle, and if it has a bud and two leaves, it's called a bai mudan, and if it has a bud and two leaves or even three leaves, but it's a very skinny bud, is called a gongmei. And if it's majority of the construct of the tea leaves or just the leaves with very little bud, and most importantly, if the tea is made when the weather is warm and humid, so there's going to be a lot of brown color in the leaves, that is a picking grade called shoumei. The tea that we're going to use for demonstration today is a bai mudan, which can be translated to white peony, and that is the second picking grade of Wei tea. So to brew Wei tea, contrary to common belief, Wei tea is actually very hardy. So you can actually use boiling water to brew Wei tea. I would actually recommend doing that, especially with good tea. This will help to bring out a lot of nuanced notes in the tea. So we use boiling water, and the amount of tea is 5 grams. And you can immediately smell a very warm East tea floral aroma from this tea. So in China, it's customary for us to not drink the first brew when using this style of brewing, because the first brew is still very diluted and it's considered rude to serve your guests a diluted brew of tea. However, I always recommend people to still have a sip of the rinse brew, and this way you can actually be able to discover a lot of the quality metrics around the tea, such as where the tea has been stored, whether or not anything unusual has happened to the tea post-production. For good tea, the tea really should not have any weird note, no moldy note, sour note, and things like that. It should just taste very light. And feel free to slurp. Yeah. But this brew is very diluted. I'm actually gonna put it aside so I can show you the first brew. So a traditional Wei tea is sun-dried. It actually goes through a very prolonged wilting process. And this traditional method not only gives the Wei tea a lot of warmth in its aroma, even though it's a cool color, it feels very warm. And it also makes the tea have a very high clarity in its note as well. If a Wei tea is fresh, so it's the current year's Wei tea, it'll have some kind of grassy East tea note. But Wei tea does have aging potential, and as the tea ages, it'll actually start to become more floral, and it'll even develop a mead note. So mead is the honey wine. It has, even though you can also say it's a honey note, but I feel like mead has a very particular aroma that honey doesn't have, and that is the note that's more comparable to the aromatic note in a white tea, an aged white tea. So the white tea that we're having today is actually from 2012, so it has a few years under its belt, and not only it has this prominent meat note, it's also quite herbaceous. For this particular one, it's also nutty. So this white tea that we're sampling today is from 2012. So it has a few years under its belt. And not only it has this very pronounced meat note, it also has more of like a fruity floral note. It's also kind of nutty. It's almost like a very intense almond milk note. This white tea is quite herbaceous as well. So in addition to white tea being very hearty, so not a very delicate tea at all, it's really, really difficult to ruin a white tea. A good white tea, no matter how hard you press the tea has a less tendency to get astringent. So it's very unlikely for white tea to get bitter. Um, Depends on the region where you get your white tea from. You can make white tea from several different cultivars. However, the traditional cultivar that is being used for white tea production can either be an heirloom cultivar, or a long time ago, there was a cultivar called China tea number 1 or Fuding Da Bai. But this cultivar is actually not very common anymore. The more common one is a cultivar called Fuding Da Hao, which has a code name called China tea number 2. And another common cultivar used in white tea in the Fuding Zhenghe region will be another a cultivar called Fuyun number 6. This particular one is from the cultivar Da Hao, so China tea number 2, which is the most common, I guess, good cultivar for the white tea. It has very large bud and very prominent tea hair as well. And the tea hair will absorb all the sunshine when we make the white tea. And that's why sometimes when we describe the note in white tea, we'll also say it's kind of like a sun-soaked cotton note. So I talk about how we make white tea basically with the sun. In a lot of ways, it is the least processed tea, even though the tea goes through a very prolonged wilting process. So there are actually a lot of metabolism that happens in the tea. So tea no longer tastes in its kind of freshest state where the fresh tea leaf is supposed to taste like. But we're also able to use this process to convert a lot of the astringency note in the tea into some of the rounder, more pleasant note in the white tea. So after we pick the white tea, the tea is first being rested under shade, usually overnight. And then the next day, if the weather is nice, we take the tea out, spread them very evenly on a tray, and start to catch the sun ray, but at an angle with the wind. So the wind will come in and cool the tea down as the sun actually increase the internal temperature of the tea leaves, but also helps to dry the tea. If the sun is too strong, we sometimes also take the tea inside. So you want a kind of very pleasant sunlight, and this is usually done in 3 days, sometimes even 4 days, depends on the condition. Of course, if we do not have the nice weather, so you cannot make tea using the sunlight, then you can also make tea in facilities where you can use different machineries to mimic the condition of the sunlight, so people will blow warm air onto the tea. But of course, using the sunlight to make white tea remains the most traditional method. And also, if we're able to hit this time mark, that's why you have a thoroughly made tea with very high level of clarity. You can feel the tea tastes so thorough and clean, and with a lot of definition in its note as well. In addition to white tea being very hearty, it can also last for many brews as well. So for this particular white tea, if you brew it really well, you can definitely make more than a dozen brews from this tea. I only make the first brew, but you can continue all the way to the 12th brew, not counting the rinse brew. And even after that, sometimes people will put the tea leaves into a kettle and boil the tea leaves, which is another method that you can use also. By that point, the tea will mostly just taste a little bit pleasantly light, but it's not going to have a lot of the complexity that you are able to enjoy with the initial brews of the tea. But that's a method for us to fully utilize the tea leaves. You can also cold brew this tea by putting the tea leaves in, so if the same 5 grams of tea, you can put it into a 1 bottle size bottle, so about 750 milliliter, and you can let the tea steep for 2 nights, so 40 to 48 hours. It doesn't have to be exactly, like noon to noon, so a little bit hour is very forgiving for white tea. The temperature is so low, you're not going to ruin the tea anyway. And then you're going to notice that the sweetness and the brightness of the white tea will come through more in a cold brew. But again, we do need the hot weather to bring out the full complexity of the tea. So that's kind of like the pros and cons. But in the summer days, you probably do want to have some cold brew white tea, which is very, very refreshing.